This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner as he discusses cold stress and what cattle producers should prepare for their livestock. Justin keeps the show rolling as he continues talking about cold stress with reminders for producers to stay safe. K-State Fashion Studies Kelsie, Doty, and Reannan Boisvert remind us about clothing choices to stay warm as well. K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd ends the show explaining how insect pests are able to survive extreme cold and how to control the pests that emerge in the spring. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing cold stress in livestock and people with K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
Justin, wanting to first talk about livestock and, of course, today, focusing a bit more towards cattle, and what are some things that producers can do to help prep their livestock?
Yeah, so good question. I think it's very timely as we get into the months of January and February. Oftentimes in the state of Kansas, those are some of the coldest, most extreme weather temperatures that we see in terms of cold stress. So I think it's always kind of a timely topic to revisit that and talk about, cold stress on cattle. What are some of the impacts? What are some mitigation strategies? Obviously, right now we've got a big winter storm that's kind of bearing down on a good chunk of the state. We're expecting some sub-zero temperatures for some extended time periods here, 2 to 3 days, I believe. Really timely to talk about some of the things. So one of the things I think we have to be aware of is that the environment that cattle are in, there's some behavioral responses that kind of are different between, confined cattle in a feedlot setting versus cattle that are going to be out in more extensive environments like pastures or out on corn stalks. So oftentimes when we get a winter weather event that comes in, that common behavioral response is for those cattle to huddle up. Where we start to see some differences between confined cattle and cattle in extensive environments is really how they react in terms of intake patterns. So a lot of times what we see in a feedlot environment or a confined environment is that cattle will often increase their dry matter intake prior to that storm. We talk about those storm fronts kind of pushing through. So it's not uncommon to see cattle intakes, actually, cattle become a little more aggressive, picking up that intake. That can really set up a scenario that creates some challenges in terms of acidosis or digestive upsets or those kind of things, especially when we couple that with, as that storm comes in, those cattle tend to maybe not go to the bunk as much, or feed delivery might be slightly delayed. And so we really start to see this disturbance in that digestive system of those cattle. And so there's some strategies that we can use in the feedlot side of things to offset that. One of those would be typically we feed additional roughage. Some operations will cover with hay. Others will feed a storm ration, which oftentimes all that storm ration means is we're simply going to add more roughage to that finishing diet potentially. Recommendations vary. A lot of times it's, maybe 2 to 4% on a dry matter basis. We'll increase that long stem roughage of the component of the diet, kind of allowing those cattle to increase their voluntary intake, but at the same time it's roughage based, so it doesn't necessarily lead to some of those digestive upsets. In most cases, we'll feed those rations for maybe 12 hours prior to that storm. And then depending on duration, usually 12 to 24, maybe 36 hours after that storm has passed, and then try to get those cattle intakes recovered. Now, on the other side of that, we have cattle that would be in those more extensive environments. So cows out on pasture, et cetera. So a lot of times what happens there is as those cattle tend to congregate up, as we get snow cover on those pastures or on those grazing environments, right, makes it more challenging for those cattle to go out and graze, right? So there we get into a situation where we're going to have to replace some of that graze forage intake with some additional supplemental feeding. Now, further compounding that problem is, so as that storm rolls through, as we see those cold temperatures, so the storm we got coming, I think our forecasted temperatures are to be, the highs are going to be in the teens for the day. So we're looking at as much as a 20 to maybe 30% increase in energy expenditure and the energy requirements of those cows. So oftentimes we may need to provide some supplemental energy to those cows that are out on pasture to help offset those increase in energy requirements and that reduced availability of grazed resources that are out there. So that can be one of the ways we can do that is to utilize a higher quality hay. We can also look at some supplemental feedstuffs. High fiber feedstuffs are certainly preferred. Dried distillers grains, a lot of byproducts would fall into that category as well. Something you mentioned before we went on air to not overlook is water. In both of those environments, that can be something that oftentimes get overlooked. In the feedlot environment, I think there's a good reminder is to always look at that water source. If we've got those continuous overflow tanks, turning that flow up a little bit to make sure we're going to keep that tank surface open. If we've got electric tank heaters, making sure that those are functioning properly, right? Electricity and water, we all know that can be a challenge, and sometimes those things don't mix, right? Then just simply clearing up, in the event we see snowfall, clearing a path to the water tanks. I think that's something that often gets overlooked as we get in there and we do some pen maintenance. The same thing would be true for cattle that are out on extensive environments. One of the advantages we do have there is that cattle, that are in extensive environments, they will consume snow to meet their water requirements. But water oftentimes can be a challenge, especially if we see significant snowfall events where it can make it a challenge to get to cattle. Something else that I also wanted to touch on just a little bit here was bedding cattle, especially at these colder temperatures. And so, one of the questions that we get a lot when we talk about bedding cattle, both cows and calves, as well as in a feedlot environment is, well, how much bedding do you want to roll out, right? And so really a good rule of thumb that I often give producers is you want to roll out enough bedding so that all the animals can actually get on that bedding and have a dry place to lay down. That's kind of our goal. Depending on the size of the cattle, that can vary greatly, right? If you've got a set of, freshly received 5 to 6 weight calves that have come in, obviously because of their body size, it's going to take less bedding to bed that particular pen of cattle than it might be some cattle that are going to be larger or some mature cows that would be out on grass. So just always something to keep in mind is a really good mitigation strategy in bedding and giving those cattle a dry place to lay down, especially, some areas of the state have seen some moisture already. So there might be some of those areas where cattle tend to congregate might already be wet or muddy. And so just giving those cattle a dry place to lay down can certainly help them weather some of the impacts of a potential winter storm event.
Do producers also need to take into account maybe helping block or redirect a little bit of wind?
Yeah, so nice segue there, but I think the windbreaks are always an important component of that. And so, anytime we talk about cold stress, right, the impact of those cold temperatures can certainly be exacerbated by increase in wind, right? So if we can do something to block the wind, that can greatly reduce the impact of cold stress on cattle. A lot of times I talk about temporary windbreaks, right? And that does tie into bedding, right? Where do you place the bedding in relationship to a potential windbreak? Usually on the downwind side, if we get it right, in terms of which direction the wind's going to blow, potentially, giving some consideration to that. In terms of temporary windbreaks, there's a lot of things, that can be used. We have some steel panel structures that are temporary now that you see a lot of producers use. Those are great. We can also, if we don't have those, we see a lot of times stock trailers tend to be commonly used, and just something to allow those cattle to get out of the wind. You can even take if it's an older stock trailer, you can even open the door on the back and create a bar or a pipe across it and allow those calves to go inside the stock trailer, and the cows will still be outside. So I've seen that done as well. I think that's just an interesting strategy for things on the farm. Another potential temporary windbreak is round bales of hay or big squares of hay, and stacking those. You can place an electric fence adjacent to those. We know there's challenges with that. A lot of times people say, well, what happens if the cattle eat it? I'm not too concerned about that. We're in a stressful environment, so that usually the cattle consuming those bales, especially if it's short term, is is not as much of a concern in what I've seen in terms of just being able to block that wind. A lot of times I suggest that if we're going to make a temporary windbreak, think about the prevailing wind, right? And maybe making a V so that we've got a little bit of protection with that V kind of pointing into the prevailing wind direction. The challenge with that in Kansas is it going to be north? Is it going to be northwest? Is it going to be northeast? So it's always kind of a challenge to know which direction we're going to get those prevailing winds to come in with a particular storm. But certainly windbreaks can be a great way to do that. Permanent windbreaks, if you've got them, that's great. But more oftentimes than not, we've kind of got to work with some portable structures, especially in cows that are going to be in more extensive environments. Cows on pasture as well, tree lines. Most producers tend to know where cattle are going to congregate when the winter storm rolls in. We can utilize those areas to stage additional hay resources. We can also bed those areas potentially as well. I think sometimes that doesn't necessarily get mentioned, but we do have the opportunity if we've got some shelter in the form of trees in a particular pasture. There's really, if cattle are going to congregate there, that can be, placing some additional bedding can be a great way to offset some of the increase in cold stress that those cattle could experience.
Once again, that was K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Justin as he continues his conversation. If you are reaching your destination and aren't going to be able to hear the rest of today's show, you can always find it online at agtoday.net or by searching for Agriculture Today on your favorite podcast platform. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner as we continue talking about cold stress for livestock and people. Justin, in the last segment, I feel like we were talking a lot about older or more mature cattle, but for those operations who are maybe fall calving and now have younger calves on the ground, is there anything they should be keeping in mind?
Yeah, so I think especially if you are a fall calving enterprise, you maybe got some cows with calves at side, having some structures where those calves can get access to that maybe the cows can't, right? There's a lot of portable structures. We talked a little bit about the trailer, right? Creating an area where those calves can get out of the weather that maybe the cows can't get back into. I think sometimes there's an increased risk of those calves getting trampled, stepped on, just giving some consideration if you have the ability to create a space where those calves can, really get out of the weather away from the cows. That's really ideal. However, that can be challenging to set up, in some particular situations, but certainly is, I think that's a good point you bring up there as well.
Are there any other categories of cattle that are also at higher risk?
Yeah, so good question. So typically I think about body condition. And so that's kind of where my mind goes to first. So those cows that are thin, right? So cattle that are in thin, maybe don't have as much condition. Those are the manner in which they experience cold stress is going to be, they're at greater risk for that than a cow that's in a more ideal or has got more of a body condition reserve. The same would be true for, let's say, growing or finishing cattle. So, cattle, lighter weight cattle, don't have as many body reserves. They're going to experience cold stress to a greater degree than cattle that have had more time on feed, et cetera, per se. So in my mind, body condition is really a big driver in that. In terms of how cattle are going to experience cold stress, and obviously, younger calves, those type of things that you would expect on the spectrum there as well.
And when you mentioned snow cover on the ground, but should producers also be hoping and expecting to see some snow cover on top of their animals if we do get some snow in Kansas?
Yeah, so we don't often talk about that a lot, right? But we certainly, as we think about, one of the things we're in January, so cattle right now have had an opportunity if they've been in Kansas, right? We're not talking about newly received feedlot calves here, but if they've been here, they've had a chance to adapt, acclimate. We should be at a point where we've got a pretty good winter hair coat in place. So a lot of times that's going to have some insulatory value for those cattle in terms of their hair, et cetera. So I don't get too concerned about, actually snow cover necessarily being on those calves. The thing that we have to take into consideration there is as that hair coat becomes wet, as it becomes damp, which oftentimes that snow will melt, and then the insulation that hair coat provides becomes diminished. And so as that hair coat becomes wet, cold stress becomes greater. And so the energy requirements go up even higher if that cold stress, if that coat is wet. So due to the fact that the cold stress is going to be greater. So oftentimes we use the rule of thumb that cold stress increases maintenance energy requirements about 1% for every 10 degrees below the lower critical temperature. So like right now, that's around 20 degrees for cattle. If that hair coat becomes wet, it's going to be about a 2% increase. So you can see where there's some changes there in terms of as that hair coat becomes wet, the amount of energy expenditure to maintain that cow's temperature is going to be, it's going to require more energy.
And at the beginning, mentioned talking about things for cold stress for humans and livestock. And we're thinking about the human aspect of this. From your perspective as growing up in agriculture, what are some things you see often get forgotten?
I think, cold stress, we experience it too on the human side of things, especially I came from a feed yard environment. So, working out in the cold, is not something that all of us, kind of grow up being accustomed to. I think, obviously those things about, dressing in layers, knowing how to take effective breaks. Also dehydration can be a problem in winter temperatures as well. So, we don't necessarily, have that same drive to go in and, take a break and get a drink that we would during the summer months, but it's just as important. Something else I always kind of mention, just because I've had some experiences when, all operations tend to use portable heating devices. And so, as we all know from fire safety prevention, those devices tend to be a very common source of barn fires, processing barn fires. So taking an extra moment to check and make sure that those devices are in good working order. Extension cords often become, a very common source of ignition and fire. So it typically, we often see an increase in barn fires and those type of things, heat lamps, all those things that we start to rely on or that are on more than they would typically be when temperatures are warmer. I think certainly increase our risk for some of those risks associated with fire, especially in ag environments.
And for people, an encouragement to maybe go inside and warm up every so often, even if it's not their typical workflow.
Exactly. And so a lot of times what we used to encourage employees in the feed yard side of things to do was, you actually end up working more out of a pickup, right? And utilizing that pickup as the opportunity to kind of come in and get, keep that truck running, use that pickup to come in depending on temperatures, come in, kind of warm up, then go back outside and do the activities that you need to do and just be strategic about it. And I think certainly being aware of, hypothermia, the buddy rule, the buddy system, that's always good to kind of follow, make sure that somebody else knows where you're going to be, especially if you're traveling out to a distant pasture to check on some cattle, those kind of things. Not maybe as big of an issue as it used to be, given the cell phone and communication devices that we have today. But I think it's always good to kind of keep some of those basic things kind of at the top of our mind when we get into some of these winter storm events.
Justin, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
All right. Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner as he discussed cold stress for cattle and people. On the topic of cold stress and hopefully staying warm in this cold weather, I would like to share part of a clip from K-State's Fashion Studies Kelsie, Doty, and Rhiannon Boisvert that we talked about in November as they share a few tips on helping people stay warm in these cool conditions. Rhiannon, as we're talking about this, what's your recommendation for people trying to stay as warm as possible?
So I think for staying warm, wool in general is always going to be that number one choice. But we can also take the environment into consideration and really think about what is necessary at this time. So if we are working with layers, I think we often recommend that people layer for the cold weather, for the rainy weather, the wet season, and a different fiber might be appropriate for each of the different layers. So for our base layers, we want something that's going to be knit and very close to the skin. We will most likely want something that is made of possibly one of those animal fibers like wool, because wool has these really great natural properties that helps to wick moisture away, wick water vapor away from the body, while also helping to keep the body warm, help to stabilize temperature. But we also have this in a lot of our synthetic fibers as well. A lot of our synthetics, like polyester, have been engineered to move moisture away from the body. So for that first layer, we want something that is very warm. We want something that's fitted, but also provides a good wicking, moisture management, dry zone next to the skin.
What about additional layers?
So we actually are big fans of a 3-layer system. So you have your first base layer right next to the skin. Again, when it gets cold, it's best to have either a wool type fiber or a synthetic. If it's a little warm out, you can get away with a cotton base layer. However, when it gets really cold, avoid the cotton layers because cotton hangs on to moisture, and that can actually be really dangerous, particularly in Kansas when you get a wind chill of -30. That's not great. So stick with wool or a synthetic base layer. And then you're going to have a mid layer. This mid layer is really important to help kind of keep air kind of entrapped next to your body. Air is actually our best thermal insulator. It's the best thing at keeping us warm. And if you have a still layer barrier of air between your base layer and your mid layer, you're going to have a much better time out in the cold. And then you're going to have an external layer, your big coat over all of that. And that's going to be the thing that kind of seals in those, be the top part of all 3 layers. And that's what's going to keep you really nice and toasty in the coldest months in Kansas when you have to go check on calves.
That was Kelsie Doty from Kansas State University's Fashion Studies and the College of Health and Human Studies, and she was joined by Reannan Boisvert with a few tips for people when it comes to staying warm in these cold conditions. If you'd like to hear the rest of this conversation we had with Kelsie and Reannan, I will link the podcast episode in today's show notes on agtoday.net. If you're wanting to look for it for yourself, it is podcast episode 2062 that came out on November 17th. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. There are a number of insect pests that overwinter in Kansas. While there are certain conditions that can impact the survival rate for overwintering insects, K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd says insects have evolved mechanisms that allow them to overcome cold temperatures.
They have their own natural antifreeze, and so that's how insects survive, whether it be freeze tolerance, freeze avoidance, supercooling. They lower their body temperature such that they're not exposed to cold temperatures. Then I did mention the snow cover acts as insulation. And what I thought I'd do for the audience to help them, let's go over some of the insects that are common and how they overwinter. So bagworms overwinters eggs in the bags. That's why we say if you remove the bags, the female bags, you remove eggs. Aphids overwinters eggs. Elm leaf beetle overwinters adults. They come into homes. Grasshoppers overwinters eggs in the soil. Spider mites overwinters eggs or adults on weeds. The Japanese beetle overwinters as larvae pupa in the soil. And eastern tint caterpillar overwinters as eggs. Other insects like scale, and I have an extension publication called Scale Insect Pest, and in there is a table of how they overwinter. Most of them overwinter as fertilized females or immature females, but some overwinter as eggs. So in that publication, there's a chart entitled How Scale Insect Pests Overwinter, whether hard or soft scales. And the reason that's important is because if they overwinter as fertilized females, immature, you can use dormant oils in the wintertime now through about March, and that will kill those. Now, the ones that overwinter as eggs, like oyster shell, pine needle, are not bothered by dormant oils because you'll kill the outer surface of the eggs, and that protects the ones inside. And so you want to know how the impact of cold temperatures will impact insects? has to be below -10 for 2 weeks to really have substantial impact on most of the insects if there's no snow cover. If there's a snow cover, then there's that insulating factor.
So what you're saying is we're still going to see all of these come springtime.
Well, that depends. Let's pick a scenario. If all the snow melts and we get really, really cold temperatures between -10 and -15, that could have a substantial impact on the ones in the soil, but also the ones that overwinter as eggs on trees, or overwinter in buildings, or overwinter in fallen debris. Yeah.
Interesting how they have this survival mechanism, and really it takes a lot, from what I'm hearing you say, it takes a lot to really impact the total population.
Well, it does. Not only that, is the beneficial insects too. If they don't survive, then when the insect pest emerge, there's no natural regulation of the populations, and so they'll take off sooner, explode. But also, another contingent factors are springs. If they're cold and rainy, that will delay emergence. Like last year, I think bagworms is 2 weeks, or if hot and dry, then that'll expedite the emergence. So all these factors, again, temperature and moisture, impact insect development, their life cycle, and when they're going to be present. And, of course, plants. The ones that feed on plants, they have to have leaves. So if the plants don't have leaves, they're not going to be out also. So that's plant phenology is another topic that is associated with overwintering cold temperatures.
Is there a possibility then to get out early in the spring and take care of some of these problems early on?
Yeah. For dormant oils, if you have like fruit trees and you've got San Jose scale, European red mite, or insects or mite pests that overwinter on trees or shrubs, then the dormant oils, which are mineral-based, will suffocate. They suffocate the stages there, and that will reduce populations. I know working with some fruit tree producers below Lawrence, we have instigated dormant oil sprays January through March and had substantial success in minimizing pests such as the San Jose scale.
A lot to think about, and as you mentioned, a lot of publications available, and most of those available through the K-State bookstore, or they can just contact their extension agent.
Yeah, Jeff, the bookstore, Kansas State University extension office, or their county office, they might have some of those publications too.
That's K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd with information on how insects overwinter. To learn more, contact your local county or district extension office. And this reminder to listen to the podcast version of Agriculture Today, visit agtoday.net, agtoday.net, or using an app on your mobile device, type these search keywords, Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. By tapping the subscribe button, brand new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device. That's agtoday.net. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.